Hey team, this is a piece titled Anti-Semitism and the Critique of Society as Economic Object by Werner Bonefeld. This is from Marcel Stoetzler's edited volume, Critical Theory and the Critique of Anti-Semitism. Let's get started. The critical tradition associated with the work of Karl Marx, Max Horkheimer, Theodore W. Adorno, and Moishe Pistone conceives of the elements of anti-Semitism as essential to the existing social relations. Footnote: I am most grateful to Marcel Stoetzler for his fabulous editorship and for an insightful account of anti-Semitism, see Lars Fischer, 2018. What is essential to society holds sway over its concept, too. Critical theory therefore formulates the critique of anti-Semitism as the critique of bourgeois society. Footnote: contemporary right-wing conservatives reject the critical theory associated with Adorno, Horkheimer, and others as a, quote, cultural Marxism, end quote, which is itself an anti-Semitic trope. The remaining defenders of the state socialist orthodoxy, by contrast, view the critical theory of anti-Semitism with suspicion because they believe it is merely meant to shield the state of Israel from criticism. Follow Moishe Pistone, though. Quote, for many on the left, anti-Semitism has been a very relevant topic, not only because of its past, but also because, as a deeply reactionary ideology that can appear to be anti-hegemonic, it poses particular challenges for progressive movements. That the discourse on anti-Semitism can be and has been instrumentalized does not mean that the topic itself should be declared outside the pale of progressive critical discourse, end quote. Email to Werner Bonefeld and others, 30th of June, 2008, in a controversy that arose over the refusal by the host of an influential Marxist email list to circulate information about a conference on anti-Semitism on the grounds that it was, quote, not a Marxist topic, end quote. Yeah, that sounds about right. End footnote. Instead of the promise of freedom, which would include the freedom from anti-Semitism, as Axel Honneth, 2010, sees it, bourgeois society contains within itself the elements of anti-Semitism. The contemporary critical theory of anti-Semitism chiefly draws on two classical texts, Horkheimer and Adorno's Elements of Anti-Semitism, originally published in 1947, which was part of their dialectic of Enlightenment, and Pistone's Anti-Semitism and National Socialism, published in 1986. Elements of Anti-Semitism conceives of the, quote, rumor about the Jews, end quote, as a form of paranoid rage against domination that is directly useful for the perpetuation of domination itself. It is hatred of difference, of that which is not the same and which is therefore secretly longed for but remains repressed for the sake of self-preservation within domination. Footnote: on elements of anti-Semitism, see Marcel Stoetzler's 2018a insightful account. Karin Stugner's account, 2014 account, employs the propositions of critical theory without expounding its critical acumen. Stugner conceives of anti-Semitism as comparable to sexism in that it amounts to a, quote, critique, end quote, of perceived weakness by a cold, masculine society. There is much to be said for her approach to social, quote, coldness, end quote, but without further conceptualization of the social relations, its meaning remains opaque. See, however, Christine Achinger's 2013 excellent account, which expounds sexism and anti-Semitism in and through the definite social relations that manifest themselves as such. I have Karin Stugner's, a work of Karin Stugner's, or Stugner's, I can't pronounce her name. Well, I have one of her papers on the channel. End footnote. According to Eva Maria Siga, the central hypothesis of their work in the early 1940s was that anti-Semitism can only be understood through society, but society can only be understood through anti-Semitism. Moïse Pastone approached anti-Semitism as a fetishized anti-capitalism, one which imagines a conflict between concrete nature, things for use values, and unnatural abstractness, money and the invisible power of the market. Footnote. In a later contribution, Moïse Pastone, in 2006, applied the notion of fetishized anti-capitalism to contemporary forms of anti-imperialism, which exonerate even the most reactionary movements, including, for example, Hamas and Hezbollah. See Butler 2010. In the UK, Butler's view defines the approach to internationalism by the Corbyn wing of the Labour Party. See Bolton and Pitt's 2018 and Chapter 11 in this volume. On this topic, see Bonefeld 2014b and Stoetzler 2018b. End footnote. While, quote, Elements, end quote, develops a critical social theory of anti-Semitism focusing on domination, Pastone's approach expounded critical insights of Marx's critique of commodity fetishism for a critique of modern anti-Semitism. Footnote. Pastone's magnum opus, Time, Labor, and Social Domination from 1993, does not consider anti-Semitism, which is odd given that he considers anti-Semitism to be a fetishized anti-capitalism. Like the Neue Marx-Lektura that developed in Germany post-1968, in West Germany post-1968, his book is an attempt at reinterpreting Marx's critique of political economy as a critical social theory. However, as I have argued elsewhere, such as Bonefeld 2004, Pastone's reinterpretation expunges the political in political economy, which leads his account towards a system theory of social action. The one contributor to the Neue Marx-Lektura who examines anti-Semitism in the context of capital is Michael Heinrich. Heinrich presents Marx's critique as a critique of capitalist social relations, and in this context expounds the critical meaning of Marx's point about the capitalist individuals as personifications of economic categories. Anti-Semitism has to do with the personalization of capitalist social reality. For an appreciation of Pastone's critical theory, see Elena Luisa Longa, 2018, and Chris O'Kane, 2018. On the Neue Marx-Lektura, see Bonefeld, 2014a. End footnote. Dude, these footnotes are mad rich. I kind of wish you would put that person on blast, though, who said that anti-Semitism wasn't a topic of Marxist discussion. Anyway, end footnote. The account assembled here does not argue for the one or the other critical theory approach to anti-Semitism. I hold that political economy is the formula of an inverted social world. Society in the inverted form of the economic object is bewitched. I argue that anti-Semitism is the, quote, rumor about the Jews, end quote, as the intangible puppet masters of the capitalist wealth that makes itself manifest in the form of money is more money. Anti-Semitism amounts to a personalized critique of a crisis-ridden dynamic of real economic abstractions, of cash, profit, and rent, and their regulation by the invisible hand of the market. Footnote, quote, cash, profit, and rent, end quote, stands as a reference to Marx's, quote, Trinity formula, end quote, in which he develops his theory of class. End footnote. Modern anti-Semitism identifies the ghost-like character of society as an economic object, the form of society that the capital fetish, Marx, makes appear as an economic objectivity, with the power of the, quote, Jews, end quote. The argument makes use of the classic text but refrains from excessive referencing. Footnote. Readers familiar with these texts will spot the references and paraphrases. Those who are not might hopefully find themselves enticed to study them. Since I first wrote on this matter, Bonefeld, 1997, my own work builds on the intersection between the critical theory of anti-Semitism and the critical theory of capitalism, developing critical theory as a critique of economic objectivity. End footnote. The chapter is in 3 sections. It starts with an account of critical theory as a critique of the ghost-like character of capitalist society. This character was already identified by Adam Smith in 1776, who posited that it is regulated by a, quote, invisible hand, end quote. There then follows a section about the elements of anti-Semitism, which I argue are innate to a critique of capitalist society, that is enthralled by the spell society has put on it. The final section explores the meaning of the inscription at the gate of Auschwitz, Arbeit macht frei, as a condensed invocation and manifestation of the elements of anti-Semitism. On the critique of political economy as a critical social theory. For a critical theory of society, it is not the independence of the economic categories of cash, profit, and rent, money and profit that requires explanation. Rather, their comprehension rests on the understanding of social relations that assume the form of reified economic things. A critical theory of society aims to think against the spell of society's dazzling economic forms. It wants to get behind their forms of appearance as the fateful forces of economic nature. It therefore does not think about reified economic things. Rather, it thinks in and through reified economic things. At least this is its critical intention. Thinking by means of definitions or identifications is quite able to say what something comes under, what it illustrates, exemplifies, or represents. It does not, however, say what something is. Thought is required to grasp reality, which in its immediacy does not tell us what it is. What, for example, really is money and what holds sway in its concept? Quote, concepts, end quote, Adorno says, quote, are moments of the reality that requires their formation, end quote. Conceptualization thus does not mean, quote, thinking, end quote, about things. Rather, conceptualization means thinking out of things. If it were really about things, then conceptualization would be external to its subject matter. Thought that does not go into its object does not recognize its object. Instead, thought treats its object as a theoretical hypothesis. Just as the critique of religion does not criticize God on the basis of God, a critical theory of capitalist political economy does not criticize real economic abstractions on the basis of real economic abstractions. Regarding the critique of religion, it thinks out of God to decipher the social relations that assume the form of God and vanish in the idea of God only to reappear as cowed believers in God, mere human derivatives of divine rule. Similarly, the critique of capitalist society is not a critique from the standpoint of economic nature. Like the critique of religion, it too deciphers the definite social relations that manifest themselves in mysterious, seemingly extra-mundane economic forces that prevail in and through the social individuals as personifications of a ghost-like economic objectivity. For a critical social theory, the fetishism of commodities entails the movement of some abstract, by themselves quite incomprehensible, economic forces that assert themselves over society as if by their own volition. Yet, however, in its nature, economic nature is in its entirety a socially constituted nature. The question of the social nature of a fateful movement of coins, which has the capacity to force a whole class of people into abject poverty without a moment's notice, is therefore one about the specific character of the capitalistically constituted social relations that assert themselves in the form of a movement of coins beyond human control. The money form disappears as a social relationship and instead asserts an abstract economic logic, which, for a critical theory of society, manifests the vanished social subject in her own social world as a mere personification of economic categories. The capitalist social subject is a coined subject, which, on the pain of ruin, bloodshed, and disaster, entails the promise of freedom as the freedom of money to beget more money. Footnote. According to Marx's critique of political economy, capitalist wealth appears in the form of an equivalent exchange relationship in which, quote, money, ... is worth more money, ... end quote. This manifestation of a, quote, value which is greater than itself, end quote, is core to Marx's conception of capital as a social subject that is, quote, acquired the occult ability to add value to itself, end quote. He asks where it gets this quality from and argues that, quote, money which begets money, end quote, entails the existence of a particular commodity, that is, labor power, whose consumption creates this surplus in value. The comprehension, then, of money as the form of value does not lie within itself. Rather, the mysterious appearance, shine, of a value equivalence between unequal values, one sum of money becoming a greater sum of money, lies in the concept of surplus value, which presupposes the class relationship between buyers and sellers of labor power. The equivalent exchange between the traders of labor power is fundamentally one between the buyers of labor power and the producers of surplus value. End footnote. Where am I? Lost my spot. Come on. Okay. In this freedom, the social individual is, quote, governed by the products of his own hand, end quote, and it is therefore his own social product that acts, quote, with the force of an elemental natural process, end quote. Money does nothing unless it is furnished with a consciousness and a will. In Marx's argument, it is the acting individuals that bestow the economic forces with such an independent will and consciousness, one that, quote, takes care of both the beggar and the king, end quote, Adorno. In this community of equals before money, quote, each pays heed to himself only, and no one worries about the rest. and precisely for that reason, either in accordance with the pre-established harmony of things, or under the auspices of an omniscient providence, they all work together to their mutual advantage for the common weal and in the common interest. End quote. Marx. Marx's ironic take on the magic of the invisible hand is the regulative principle of bourgeois freedom, as economic compulsion is founded on the understanding that the social practice of the individuals manifests itself not only behind their backs, but that it also prevails only in and through them. Marx captures well the inversion of human practice as an action of things when he writes in the section on the money fetish that, quote, a social relation, a definite relation between individuals, appears as a metal, a stone, as a purely physical external thing, which can be found as such in nature and which is indistinguishable in form from its natural essence. End quote. Social objectivity does not lead a life of its own. Social objectivity is not a force of nature. Rather, social objectivity is a socially constituted objectivity. Social relations vanish from sight, though, when social relations take the form of appearance of a piece of metal or stone, and this appearance is as real as the circumstance that the economic object imposes itself on the acting subjects as if regulated by an invisible hand. There is only one world, and that is the world of appearances. What appears in society as a, quote, coin, end quote, in its fateful movement is in fact the manifestation of a definite social relationship between individuals that takes the form of a relationship between coins. Marx's point that, quote, the monstrous objective power which social labor itself created opposite itself as one of its moments, end quote, is the key to the critique of political economy as a critical social theory. Marx argues that the monstrous economic power is not only a product of social labor, but also beyond the control of the social individuals, who appear as mere personifications of their own social world. He thus characterizes the commodity as a sensuous, supersensible thing. The fetishism of commodities does not disguise the, quote, real, end quote, social relations of capitalism. Rather, the fetishism of commodities expresses the, quote, real, end quote, social relations in the form of a movement of economic quantities. That is to say, the economic world contains the social individual within itself as the sensuous personification of her own reified social world. Marx's work focuses on forms, quote, at first on forms of consciousness, i.e., religion, philosophy, morality, law, then later on the forms, of political economy. For Marx, the focus on forms was identical with the critique of the inverted forms of social existence, an existence constituted by the life practice of human beings, end quote. Helmut Reichelt. That is, every social, quote, form, end quote, even the simplest form, like, for example, the commodity, quote, is already an inversion and causes the social relations to appear as relations between things, end quote, and this appearance is real. The things objectify themselves and the social individuals as the, quote, bearers of particular class relations and interests, end quote. Marx. In this inverted world, the individuals subsist as coined factors of production, quote, mere exploited human material, end quote, and yet entirely dependent on the profitability of their living labor in competition with all other exploited human material on a global scale. Quote, men owe their life to what is being done to them, end quote, Adorno. Although men, quote, are little better than cogs, end quote, to the capitalist form of social wealth. Men depend on the global competitiveness of their exploitation to, quote, dodge the freedom to starve, end quote, Adorno. Unprofitable employers of labor power go under, shedding labor, thus weakening the strength of the link to the means of subsistence for the redundant surplus value producers. Profit is primary, the satisfaction of human needs a, quote, mere sideshow, end quote. Capitalist wealth appears in the form of money as more money, and the necessity of more money objectifies itself in the persons as mere, quote, agents of value, end quote, who depend for their life on the manner in which the logic of economic things unfolds. Footnote. Marx posits the general formula of capital as, quote, value in process, money in process, end quote, and expounds, quote, value in process, end quote, as the process of, quote, valorization, end quote, that is, the Verwertung of social labor. Capitalist wealth is entirely abstract, or as Riccardo Bellofiore in 2009 put it, value is, quote, strictly speaking, a ghost, end quote, of a social labor time, quote, made abstract, end quote. Bonefeld, 2010, end footnote. What a monstrosity! An economic thing, this coin, which is thrown into circulation so that it yields more money, that in its nature really is nothing more than a piece of metal, manifests itself as a seemingly independent economic force which, quote, the life of all men hangs by, end quote, Adorno. For the acting subjects, society thus appears as an uncontrollable economic subject to which they are bound by seemingly invisible threads. Indeed, the individuals carry their relationship with society and therewith their access to the means of subsistence in their pockets. Although coins tend to inflate or become depressed, they are not subjects. Yet they are the subject of society as essentially a process of money-making, imposing themselves on and also in and through the acting individuals to the point of madness and disaster, from the socially necessary consciousness of cash, profit, and rent, to abject misery and bloodshed. Man is turned, quote, into money, or money is incorporated in man. Human individuality, human morality itself, has become both an object of commerce and the material in which money exists. Instead of money or paper, it is my own personal existence, my flesh and blood, my social virtues and importance, which constitute the material corporeal form of the spirit of money. End quote, Marx. Footnote. See Bonefeld 2020 for an account of money as a real abstraction of capitalist wealth and as a corporeal social power. End footnote. All right, I think I found my spot. All right, here we are. The mythological idea of fate becomes no less mythical when the idea of fate is demythologized, quote, into a secular, quote, logic of things, end quote, that akin to an abstract system logic structures the behaviors of the actual individuals by means of competing price signals, and threatens their livelihood through loss of access to the means of subsistence, because the expenditure of their living labor turned out to have been unprofitable, bankrupting their employer and making them redundant. That is, the logic of things, quote, prevails over mankind as something that prevails in them, as traders in labor power. The one buying to make a profit, the other selling to gain wage-based access to the means of subsistence. Adorno. In this society, the products of labor that cannot be converted into money are valueless regardless of the needs that those products of labor could satisfy. What has no value in exchange has no utility, and is therefore burnt or left to rot. That is, however much the individual might try to raise herself above the law of value, and raise she must for the sake of maintaining the civil character of capitalist labor economy, preventing cutthroat competition and thus, quote, bloodshed, end quote, she remains a coined subject of cash, rent, and profit. The strength of her connection to the means of life depends on the movement of the abstract economic things over which she has no control, and which impose themselves with at times devastating force, cutting society off from the means of subsistence in the blink of an eye. For the producers of surplus value, the inability to sell their redundant labor power spells disaster to the point of destitution and death. Keynes characterized this inability to trade as involuntary unemployment. Nobody can price themselves into work even for an apple and a pie. What is the price of a kidney? What is the value of life? Never mind. Next section. On the elements of anti-Semitism. I have argued that in capitalism, the individuals are governed by the fateful movement of economic abstractions. The point of critique can therefore not be to, quote, make the individual responsible for relations whose creature he socially remains, end quote. Footnote. Michael Heinrich similarly expounds anti-Semitism as personalization of the capital fetish, end footnote. It is therefore not sufficient to criticize capitalists for their seemingly excessive addiction to profit, nor is it sufficient to criticize bankers for pursuing money for the sake of more money. On the pain of ruin, these behaviors manifest the, quote, objective necessity, end quote, of capitalistically constituted social relations. In this context, the question, what is criticized, becomes an important question. How does one oppose the fateful movement of coins? Who really is responsible? Clearly, the critique of the banker or any other socioeconomic operative in a system that asserts itself as an independent force over and through the social individuals misses the object of critique. As a critical theory, the critique of political economy is not a critique of the personifications of the economic categories. Rather, it is a critique of the capitalistically organized social relations of reproduction that assume the form of a movement of economic things and in turn objectify themselves in the individual person as the human agent of her own forsaken world. Nevertheless, while every individual is, quote, ruled by economic abstractions, end quote, the owners of great wealth experience this rule as a source of great enrichment and power. In this context, Horkheimer and Adorno have argued that the, quote, rulers, end quote, are safe for as long as the, quote, ruled, end quote, struggle under the spell of the inverted world, in which, say, the cause of financial crisis, economic downturn, conditions of austerity and abject poverty, and competitive pressures are attributed to the greedy behavior of some known peddlers of misery. Adorno. A spellbound critique of capitalism demands more of this and less of that. A spellbound critique of capitalism attributes the fateful movement of the economic forces to the individual will of the greedy moneymaker, apportions blame and proclaims to know, quote, how to set things right, end quote. It is founded on the rumor that the capitalist economy has been corrupted by some greedy self-seekers and that capitalism can therefore be made to work for the benefit of the national friends once the ghost-like power of the peddlers of misery has been curbed for good. This critique of capitalism does not reject capitalism. This critique of capitalism demands a better capitalism, a capitalism that manifests the promise of the wealth of nations in opposition to the freedom of world market profits. This critique of capitalism is entirely false to the point of murder. Not only does this critique of capitalism leave capitalist society entirely untouched by thought, but this critique of capitalism also attributes capitalist conditions to the conscious activity of some supposedly guilty party and demands action to sort things out. This personalization of the movement of economic categories entails a number of differentiations, most importantly between the productive or indeed creative capitalist as a, quote, producer of, quote, real wealth employing hard-working and creative people, and the financial or indeed parasitic capitalist who makes his fortune by speculating in money to the detriment of the established system of national wealth. Here, the distinction between material, national wealth and the financial wealth of money appears in the forms of distinct personalities, pitting the creative industrialist against the parasitic banker-cum-speculator. There emerges, then, the idea of a capitalism that is corrupted by the financial interests, for the benefit of the few and to the detriment of the many. Finance stands accused of turning capitalism into a profit-making system that at the expense of national industry, national wealth, national progress, national fortune, and harmony of interest seeks money for the sake of more money. In this view, the capital fetish, which manifests itself in the form of money as the, quote, most senseless, incomprehensible... One second. Where am I? In this view, the capital fetish, which manifests itself in the form of money, as the, quote, most senseless, incomprehensible, end quote, form of wealth, quote, most senseless, incomprehensible form, end quote, of wealth, is not a fetish at all. Rather, it presents the wealth of parasites of some intangible external enemy within, and wealth in money accumulates as the consequence of the allegedly parasitic activity of the bankers, the financiers, and the speculators. In a society that asserts itself behind the backs of the acting subjects, the elements of anti-Semitism project the acting bearers, Träger, of the economic categories of money and finance as the hostile, cosmopolitan subjects that, having no roots in the industry of the nation, grow rich by speculating on the wealth created by hard-working national people. That is, a definite form of social relations manifests itself in the form of a movement of coins and then, under the spell of this coined movement, rebels against the personifications of a world governed by coins. This rebellion is entirely conformist and regressive. Instead of rejecting the capitalist social relations which contain the, quote, pauper, end quote, in those relations' conception of wealth, Marx, it seeks the promise of freedom from the speculator's yoke and a better market position for itself at the expense of the identified wrongdoer, the so-called merchants of greed. For the sake of the nation, something needs to be done. Something can be done. The personalized critique of the capitalist social relations is open to abuse from the outset. The personalized critique of the capitalist social relations thinks akin to a register of blame, and, once radicalized to the point of maddening fury, condemns the identified party as a bloodsucker who drains the living life out of the national community of a hard-working people. It demands renewal of the nation, to make the nation strong again, in opposition to the world market society of capital, which is condemned as a network of money and power that conspires against the supposed nature of a national people, who appears thus as hapless victims of the cosmopolitan peddlers of greed and their military backers. Footnote. The idea that so-called neoliberal capitalism resulted from a Washington-based agreement between money and power, the so-called Washington Consensus, purports the idea, at least by implication, of a conspiratorial construction of finance-driven world economy. That, buttressed by the political and military might of the United States, exploits the nations of the world for financial gain. For example, Petros. This is just a side note. One of the authors who I've posted on this channel who critique left-wing anti-Semitism from a radical left position, Yves Coleman, has a paper on the no borders, no fatherlands, or however you pronounce that in French. The patres, something, I don't know. But that Yves Coleman has a paper about James Petrus with like a very, very like aggressive title. It's like anti-Zionist, anti-Semite, reactionary, something like that. So I don't know what the grounds are for calling James Petrus that. I know nothing about James Petrus, but it seems the fact that it seems like it would be interesting to read some of these critiques of this guy, because if it's being referenced here, so maybe in the future I'll read that critique of James Petrus. Yeah. All right. Okay. End footnote. The identification of the, quote, guilty parties, end quote, personalizes the relations of economic objectivity. The identification of the guilty parties points the finger accusingly at the identified foe of the national community. Under the spell of identification, it denounces the alleged wrongdoer, and once radicalized into blind resentment, becomes demagogic in its demand for retribution. Who hides behind the invisible hand of the market? What is his name? Where does she live? How do they look, walk, pray? How can the invisible wrongdoer of the nation be made visible? It's actually kind of an interesting thing, like of making the invisible wrongdoer of the nation visible, because if you look at the work of the historian Jeffrey Herf on Yad Vashem, that's how you pronounce it. You look at his little video that he talks about how it's hard for people in the West to conceptualize the content of what anti-Semitism entails, because they rightfully understand persecution in terms of differences of appearance based upon the American experience. And what he emphasizes is that the Nazis, in the instance of the Nazis didn't really know who the Jews were. In terms of just like being able to spot them on the street, it wasn't like you could just look at somebody and say, they're Jewish. That's part of why like the armband and like the explicit identification of themselves as Jewish became necessary, because the concept, the prejudice that they had is irreducible to the anti-Semitism is irreducible to discrimination on the basis of biological characteristics. There's an entire story and narrative about the evilness of Jews, not their subhumanness, although that eventually obviously becomes a factor, but their evilness, their fundamental hostility to the welfare not just of one particular national community, but to national communities as such. So it's interesting that there's this little line here that says, how can the invisible wrongdoer of the nation be made visible? Sorry, that's might not exactly be, a reference to what I'm talking about, but it seems relevant and interesting, because I'm not an expert on anti-Semitism by any means, and I'm not Jewish, and I grew up around no Jewish people. So understanding the content of anti-Semitism is very much a learning experience for myself. No. So, according to Adorno and Horkheimer in Dialectic of Enlightenment, the image of the Jew is ready-made for this personalization. Modern anti-Semitism feeds on the Christian anti-Semitism that indicts the, quote, Jew, end quote, as the assassin of Jesus. They have blood on their hands, and as a trafficker in money, and it thus accuses the Jew to pursue unholy, unproductive activities. The image of the Jew is that of a parasite, money and finance, speculators and bankers. Quote, no matter what the Jews as such may be like, their image, as that of the defeated people, has the features to which totalitarian domination must be completely hostile. Happiness without power, wages without work, a home without frontiers, religion without myth. These characteristics are hated by the rulers because the ruled secretly long to possess them, end quote. Horkheimer and Adorno. The projected Jew thus appears as a figure of undeserved liberation from sweat and toil. That is, as one that does not submit to hard work, factory organization, struggle to make ends meet, and is hated as such. Anti-Semitism turns the, quote, longing, end quote, for freedom from want and for a life beyond the mere existence as human material of, quote, personified labor time, end quote, into a devastating denunciation. Anti-Semitism rejects the Jew as the one who lives in comfort by exploiting the many for monetary gain. Footnote. As Marx observed, if, quote, time is everything, bracket, then, end bracket, man is nothing, man is at most time's carcass, end quote, Marx, end footnote. The anti-Semite says, our misery is the foundation of Jewish wealth. Horkheimer and Adorno thus argue that the, quote, rulers, end quote, are safe for as long as the, quote, ruled, end quote, struggle under the spell of the inverted world, in which, say, the cause of financial crisis, economic downturn, and conditions of austerity, desperate struggles to make ends meet, are attributed to the greedy behavior of some identifiable others. For the apologists of capitalist society, the reference to the individual hand operates like an explanatory subterfuge. It explains everything with reference to the invisible. For the anti-Semite, however, behind the invisible stands, quote, the Jew, end quote, so that the invisible power of the market is explained too. The category, quote, Jew, end quote, does not refer to a concrete person. It refers to an abstraction. For the anti-Semite, the, quote, Jew, end quote, is the intangible and all-powerful puppet master of national misery. It is not capitalism as such that is rejected. What is rejected is so-called Jewish capitalism, that is, financial capitalism. According to contemporary economic thinking, this capitalism is said to extract, quote, financial profit directly out of the personal income of workers and others, end quote, which, quote, may be called financial expropriation, end quote. Lapavitsas. Lapavitsas, I think it's Kostas Lapavitsas, has a book titled How Finance Exploits Us All, or something to that effect. Which is like a lot of the critical theory interpretations of Marx would and I'm sure there's other ones too, would very much reject this exclusive abstracting of finance capital from the overall dehumanizing system of capitalistically organized society. They would view it as a highly problematic and incomplete critique. And the incomplete critique can lead to personalizations of capital as the product, the inhuman consequences of capitalism being the product not of a system rendered of impersonal power relations, but of nasty individuals. Anyway, back to the text. Not me yakking to myself. This argument about financial capitalism denies that capitalism is in fact a monetary system. Footnote. The insight that capitalism is a monetary system is of crucial significance to the Neue Marktslektura. See Bachhaus, 1975, Chris Arthur, 2005, Christian Lotz, 2014, and Michael Heinrich, 2017. End footnote. The point here is not that the critique of financial capitalism as a system of greed is in itself anti-Semitic. Footnote. It is, however, the case that the contemporary populism proclaims against financial globalization ostensibly in order either to make the nation great again or to make the economy work for the many. Whilst the nationalism of the right articulates a nativist prejudice against globalization, the, quote, progressive nationalism, end quote, of the left endorses an inward-looking national Keynesian response to financial globalization, ostensibly in support of the national labor economy. On the nationalism of the left, see Hugo Radis, 2014, and Werner Bonefeld, 2008. On the differences between them and on the, quote, national, end quote, logic that holds sway in the overlap, see Abramite, 2018, end footnote. However, the critique of financial capitalism as a system of greed's incomprehension of money as the form of value opens the Pandora's box in which the elements of anti-Semitism lie in wait. Hardened by the cold stare of the elements of anti-Semitism, it posits the financialization of capitalism as a sucker's paradise, one in which the promise of opulence for the many, brought about by a well-functioning national labor economy, is crushed by a few cosmopolitan peddlers of misery. What makes money Jewish? What is Jewish capitalism? And what is the concrete nature of a capitalist labor economy? For the anti-Semite, the radicalized subject of conformist rebellion, financial capitalism amounts to a Jewish conspiracy. He demands jobs and conditions for a people of an imagined national nature, defined by the camaraderie of soil and blood, and seeks the imaginary power and money wealth of the projected foe for himself. Anti-Semitism articulates a senseless and barbaric discontent with conditions. Anti-Semitism's rebellion for concrete nature eliminates even the glimpse of a life beyond, quote, domination, end quote. Because anti-Semitism's anti-capitalism leaves capitalism entirely untouched, anti-Semitism is totalitarian in character, as, quote, it seeks to make the rebellion of suppressed nature against domination directly useful to domination, end quote, to the point of utter destruction, Horkheimer and Adorno. Auschwitz is this destruction. For Adorno, it confirmed the bourgeois relations of pure identity as death. It identified man as a metaphysical distraction to the business at hand. What counts is what can be numbered and subsist as such in a numbered manner, mere material. Every number is a resource, and if that number is not a resource, that number is not worth anything at all. What cannot be used anymore is gassed and burnt. There is no time to waste. Arbeit macht frei. It is important to distinguish between the elements of anti-Semitism, which are often unacknowledged and refuse to answer to that name, and fully fledged anti-Semitism, which is openly recognizable and goes by that name. Fundamentally, anti-Semitism, quote, is the rumor about the Jews, end quote. The rumored Jew has no concrete existence. The Jew exists as an abstract and appears as an invisible, entirely intangible, and cunning foe who is difficult to pin down. The elements of anti-Semitism reject the hated forms of capitalism and attribute them to the hidden nature of the intangible Jew, who, like the invisible hand, is everywhere and meddles in everything. The elements of anti-Semitism are innate to the conspiracy theory of capitalist development. According to the rumor, the cunning Jew stands behind phenomenon. And who stands behind the phenomena is the hidden and invisible puppet master of the world. Anti-Semitism is first of all an attempt at unmasking and making visible, quote, the Jew, end quote, be it by desecrating the soil of her final resting place, or by attaching a star to her clothes and place of business. It is an attempt at making visible the grinning speculator behind the human facade. It does not matter who the concrete individual is. What matters is visibility, and what is made visible is marked out for ridicule, arson, and destruction. What has fallen from its pedestal can be kicked with joyless pleasure and cheerful persistence. The elements of anti-Semitism, by contrast, do not necessarily entail the pogrom as its automatic destiny. They prepare the ground, point the finger, spread the rumor, and establish the legitimation for this perverted rebellion against capitalism. Ulrike Meinhof, the late co-founder of the Red Army faction, gave a frighteningly poignant example of the rationalization of anti-Semitism as a hatred of capitalism when she wrote that, quote, Auschwitz means that 6 million Jews were killed and thrown on the waste heap of Europe for what they were, money Jews. Finance capital and the banks, the hard core of the system of imperialism and capitalism, had turned the hatred of men against money and exploitation and against the Jews. ... Anti-Semitism is really a hatred of capitalism. End quote. Ulrike Meinhof. Jews are murdered supposedly, quote, for what they are, end quote. Supposedly anti-Semitism, quote, really, end quote, is anti-capitalism. Meinhof slides here, possibly without being aware of it, from describing to articulating and voicing one of the most potent elements of anti-Semitism. When anti-Semites attack capitalism, what counts as success? Footnote. On the question of success, see the contributions to Stoetzler, 2014. The previous section argued that anti-Semites divide the social world between the hated abstract forms of capitalism, especially finance and money capital, and the social world's concrete natural substance. The concrete is conceived as immediate, direct matter for use as well as rooted in industry and productive activity. Money, on the other hand, is not only conceived of as the root of all evil, but also as rootless. Money is judged to exist not only independently from industrial capital, but also over and against industrial capital. The dynamic movements of money for the sake of more money erode the natural substance of the nation, its soil and its blood, its industry and productive enterprise. In this way, money and financial capital are identified with capitalism, while industry and productive labor are perceived as constituting the concrete and creative being of a national people. Thus, industry and enterprise are, quote, made, end quote, capitalist by Jewish money. Money penetrates all expressions of industry and thus perverts and disintegrates the community of the people in the name of financial capital's destructive quest for self-expansion. The force and power of money is seen to undermine the individual in terms of entrepreneurship, the creative in terms of national industry, the rooted in terms of the imagined traditions of blood and soil. the communities in terms of a paternalist direction of use value production. These elements of their ideology enable the anti-Semites not only to embrace and promote a productive national form of capitalism, but also to declare that labor leads to freedom. The approval of the Volksgenosse, I don't know if I'm saying that right, the comradely member of the national racial community, as the personification of concrete nature, blood, soil, and industry goes hand in hand with the denunciation of, quote, the Jew, end quote, as the personalized power of economic abstractions. In this manner, the ideology of blood and soil on the one hand, and that of machinery and unfettered industrial expansion on the other, are projected as images of a healthy nation that stands ready to purge itself from the perceived enemies of the national labor economy. That is, the abstract, universal, rootless, mobile, intangible, international, quote, vampire, end quote, of, quote, Jewish capitalism, end quote. Extermination is itself an effort exerted in terms of concrete nature, directed at concrete human bodies and consisting of a material process and thus industrialized. All Volksgenossen have committed the same deed and have thus become truly equal to each other. Their efficiently discharged occupation only confirmed what they already knew. They had lost their individuality and were set loose as a hard-working subject of extermination. Anti-Semitism is the national fury that is set loose in the shape of a maddened subject seeking liberation from an imaginary foe whom it has identified and nailed down with name and address. Its furious affirmation of its own maddening reality is, quote, the substitute for the dream that humanity could organize its world humanely, a dream that a man-made world is stubbornly rejecting, end quote. Adorno. Indeed, Auschwitz confirmed the, quote, stubbornness, end quote, of the principle of, quote, abstraction, end quote, not only through extermination for extermination's sake, but also and because of it, through, quote, abstractification, end quote. The abstract concept, quote, Jew, end quote, was made into a cipher and thereby made abstract. Whatever could be used was consumed and taken away, teeth, hair, skin, labor power. Whatever remained was made abstract and visible, smoke disappearing into the air. Everything is thus changed into pure nature. The economic abstraction was not only personalized, but also, quote, abstractified, end quote. At the gates of Auschwitz, the Volksgenossen made it clear that money does not liberate anybody from concrete nature. In fact, they put up a sign there that pronounced with deadly intent that the labor of Auschwitz is to liberate the concrete from the abstract to the vanishing point of death. Not money, but, quote, labor makes you free, end quote. Arbeit macht frei, until the laboring ceases because the laborer is dead. Labor liberates the concrete from the abstract. Normality is death. Industry is the bond of soil and blood. Extermination is efficiently discharged. Extermination manifests, quote, the stubbornness of the life to which one has to conform and to resign oneself, end quote. Upon the arrival at the factory of death, everybody was assessed for sure. Those deemed unable to work were discarded without second thought. Those deemed able to work were worked until death liberated them from life. Auschwitz was a factory, quote, to destroy the personification of the abstract. Its organization was that of a fiendish industrial process, the aim of which was to, quote, liberate, end quote, the concrete from the abstract. The first step was to dehumanize, that is, to strip away the, quote, mask, end quote, of humanity, of qualitative specificity, and reveal the Jews for what, quote, they really are, end quote. Shadows, ciphers, numbered abstraction, mere disposable human material. Then follow the process to, quote, eradicate that abstractness, to transform it into smoke, trying in the process to wrest away the last remnants of the concrete material, quote, use values, end quote, clothes, gold, hair, soap, end quote, postone. Adorno and Horkheimer's point that, quote, anti-Semitic behavior is generated in situations where blinded men robbed of their subjectivity are set loose as subjects, end quote, describes a pogrom. It does not capture the labor of Auschwitz. Nobody there was set loose. Everybody worked in a disciplined manner until the end with relentless dedication to achieve the task at hand. Arbeit macht frei addresses the rumor about the easy-living Jews with industrialized intent. It says Jews are put to work here until they are no more, and that is the Volksgenossen's labor of liberation. Conclusion. In his critique of Carey's economic nationalist ideas, Marx argued forcefully that, quote, these world market disharmonies are merely the ultimate adequate expression of the disharmonies which have become fixed as abstract relations within the economic categories, or which have a local existence on the smallest scale, end quote. Marx. Footnote. Henry Charles Clay, 1793 to 1879, was the chief economic advisor to President Abraham Lincoln. Henry Charles Carey argued for a, quote, America First, end quote, economic strategy in line with Madison's and later List's nationalist economic ideas, arguing that economic development, quote, infant industry, end quote, needs to be protected from world market pressures through a system of tariffs until it is able to conquer the world of wealth by its own efforts. End footnote. Global, quote, disharmony, end quote, exists in and through the, quote, domestic relations, end quote, and vice versa. Yet it appears as if national, state, and economy are accountable to, and at the mercy of, a nebulous force personified as the global economy. Quote, national wealth, end quote, national industry, and national employment and wages are seen to be at the mercy of intangible outside forces that impose themselves upon a hard-working national people with devastating effect. Here on this side of the line, then, is the real community of a people, and over there, then, is the rootless cosmopolitan speculator. The perception of the nation as a community of a people who are kept in submission to the exigencies of a financialized global economy is entirely regressive. It lends itself to the ideology of the nation as a subject of liberation, which is as irrational as the belief in a national nature, a national homogeneity of purposes, and a national destiny from the national industry via the national interest and the national history to the national being. The idea of the nation as the foundation of being and becoming turns the concept of, quote, cosmopolitanism, end quote, into a term of abuse. In its stead, it puts its faith in the imagined community of the nation as some naturally rooted and active thing, which it idolizes as the, quote, spirit of the people, end quote. If indeed it is permissible at all to speak about the national spirit of the people, it is a national spirit not by nature but by history. By reducing history to nature or by reading nature into history, the struggle for national liberation from the strictures of the world market becomes delusional. People are forced to act as if they really are natural forces that have a national history. Footnote. This part draws on Adorno. End footnote. There is, says Adorno, a need for a, quote, practice that fights barbarism, end quote. However, barbarism cannot be fought in a direct and immediate manner. What really does it mean to struggle against money, resist the movement of coins, combat the movement of interest rates, fight price movements, and resist the law of economic value in a mode of social reproduction which is founded on a class of dispossessed surplus value producers? A, quote, practice that fights barbarism, end quote, is about the social relations that manifest themselves in the logic of seemingly self-moving economic forces. Clearly, it is possible to hold coins responsible for their movement. The personalized critique of the movement of coins contains the elements of anti-Semitism. Personalization entails attribution. Personalization attributes the fateful movement of the economic forces to the identifiable image of the national foe, and demands retribution. The elements of anti-Semitism attribute blame and thus personalize the critique of the false society to the point of blind fury. The rumor about the Jews provides an outlet for anger and hatred and a target which can be attacked at will. The rumor about the Jews comprehends nothing. It is therefore all-pervasive and all-embracing. The Jew is said to stand behind the fateful economic phenomenon and is thus condemned as a conspiring parasite. This condemnation is totalitarian in character in that it identifies the fateful dynamic of the economic forces with the character of the Jews, and what is identified as Jewish in character is secretly longed for. The anti-Semite speculates in death and banks the extracted gold teeth. Innate to the elements of anti-Semitism is the desire to live the beautiful life of the condemned Jew. Thanks for listening.